Welcome to The Real Voices, where every moment is inspired by truth. Some stories heal, some haunt, and some remind us what it means to be human. Tell us where you're listening from. Your voice matters here. And let us know how we can make every story feel more real, more alive, and closer to your heart. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and let the story unfold. One bride, 4 husbands, and a curse. The late summer sky hung heavy with pale gold light as Molly Whitaker leaned out of the car window, her eyes fixed on the winding gravel drive that led through a corridor of ancient oak trees. In the distance, Hallworth Manor emerged like something from a painting, its stone facade ivy-wrapped and bathed in a honeyed hue by the setting sun. Towering chimneys whispered smoke into the air. A row of fluttering bunting flanked the estate gates, and lanterns swayed gently from iron hooks. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the folds of her ivory skirt. This was it. Her new life. Her new family. Lawrence sat beside her, silent and composed in his dark grey tailored suit, eyes fixed ahead. He hadn't spoken much since they left the registry office in York. Molly told herself it was nerves. After all, marrying into a family like the Hallworths was no small step. They were landed, respected, and, according to whispers in her old London flat, deeply private. As their car rolled to a halt, a sudden eruption of clapping and cheers met them. The entire village, it seemed, had been summoned to welcome the bride. Dozens of faces, familiar only by name, surrounded them like a tide. Women in floral dresses tossed rose petals into the air, children waved white handkerchiefs, and the village choir, led by the Reverend himself, broke into a gentle folk hymn. A few steps ahead stood Gladys Hallworth, Lawrence's mother. Tall and statuesque even in her 60s, she wore a slate blue gown and a strand of pearls that looked older than the manor itself. Her sharp grey eyes fixed on Molly with a smile that didn't quite reach them. "My dear," she exclaimed, stepping forward and pressing a light kiss to Molly's cheek. "We've all been waiting to meet our beautiful new addition." Before Molly could respond, Gladys took her hand and turned to face the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen of Greywick," she announced in a commanding tone, "I present to you Mrs. Molly Hallworth, a bride worthy of the Hallworth name." A ripple of applause swept through the gathering. Molly offered a shy smile, glancing to Lawrence for reassurance, but he had already turned away, nodding to a man near the bar set up under a willow tree. "You must be exhausted from the journey," Gladys said briskly, looping her arm through Molly's. "Come, let me show you where you'll be staying. Everyone else can enjoy the festivities." They moved through the crowd, and Molly noticed something peculiar. People seemed to part instinctively for Gladys, stepping aside with small nods and nervous smiles. She carried herself like royalty, and everyone treated her as such. Inside, the manor was breathtaking, vaulted ceilings, dark wood paneling, oil portraits of brooding ancestors, and furniture so well polished it gleamed. Molly passed a portrait of a woman with haunting blue eyes and paused. Something about the expression, proud, defiant, resigned, made her stomach flutter. "That was my grandmother Eleanor," Gladys said, noticing her glance. "She too married into this house. Quite a woman, in her time." "I can see that," Molly murmured. Her new bedroom was vast, its 4-poster bed draped in lace and crimson velvet. The windows overlooked the northern paddocks and the walled rose garden below. On a side table, a silver-framed photo of Lawrence as a child had already been placed. The gesture made Molly smile. At least someone had tried to make it feel like home. "I'll let you rest," Gladys said, smoothing the bed covers unnecessarily. "Dinner is at 7. We keep traditions at Hallworth." As the door clicked shut, Molly exhaled, letting the weight of the day finally settle on her shoulders. She was married to Lawrence, into a family so old and proud they probably had bloodlines mapped in Latin. And yet, something felt off. The evening meal was served in the great dining hall, a room so grand it belonged in a museum. Dozens of candles lit the table, where over 20 guests sat, toasting, laughing, eating. Molly, seated at the head beside Gladys, scanned the long table. No sign of Lawrence. "Has anyone seen Lawrence?" she asked softly, leaning towards her mother-in-law. Gladys barely turned her head. "Oh, he had some matters to attend to. He'll join us later." "But it's our wedding night." "Lawrence is a responsible young man. You'll come to appreciate that." Her tone was smooth but final. Before Molly could press further, a voice cut across the room. "Well, now that's no way to leave the bride alone." A tall man approached, a few years older than Lawrence, with a stronger build and a smirk that didn't quite match the warmth in the room. His hair was darker, his eyes deep-set and calculating. "Molly, is it? I'm Gregory, Lawrence's elder brother." He leaned in and kissed her hand, eyes not leaving hers. "You're quite the beauty. Hallworth hasn't seen such grace since mother's youth." A few guests chuckled nervously. Molly withdrew her hand with a polite smile. "Pleased to meet you, Gregory." "Likewise." He pulled out the chair beside her and sat. "Lawrence always did have good taste." She looked again toward the hallway. Still no sign of her husband. Later that night, as Molly stood alone on the balcony adjoining her new room, watching fireflies dance above the garden hedges, her heart ached with confusion. Why had Lawrence disappeared? Why had Gregory stepped in so confidently, like he'd taken the seat reserved for someone else? She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of the quiet that surrounded the manor. Not peaceful, but expectant. Far below in the courtyard she saw Gladys standing alone, speaking softly to Gregory, who now held a glass of something dark and strong. He laughed, then turned, and for a second looked straight up at her window. Molly took a step back. Something about this house, these people, and this perfect day was starting to feel like a well-rehearsed play, and she wasn't sure which role she was meant to play, or if she ever had a choice at all. The morning sun spilled lazily across the windows of Hallworth Manor, casting long amber slats across the oak floors. Molly stirred beneath the heavy brocade duvet, the fragrance of lavender sachets mingling with the earthy damp of old stone and polished wood. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was, until the creak of the door jolted her into awareness. A maid stepped inside without knocking. Her face was plain, expression unreadable. "Mrs. Hallworth," she said curtly, placing a silver tray on the nightstand. "Lady Gladys has sent your morning tea." Molly blinked, disoriented. Is Lawrence up?" The maid didn't answer. She simply nodded and left. Still in her nightdress, Molly walked barefoot to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. A low fog hung over the distant moorland, curling like smoke around the hedgerows. The rose garden below looked untouched, almost eerily symmetrical. She turned toward the side table to fetch her phone, intending to call her mother. But it wasn't there. She checked the drawer. Empty, the bedside table, her travel bag. Panic stirred in her gut. She descended the stairs quickly, her silk dressing gown trailing behind her. The manor was unnaturally quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Gladys was seated in the drawing room, sipping from a porcelain teacup, flanked by two of the village women who had attended the wedding. "Ah, there she is," Gladys said, not looking up. "Molly, darling, come, we were just talking about your lovely ceremony." "Lady Hallworth," Molly said, her voice measured. "My phone is missing." Gladys looked up with a serene expression. No need for that tone, dear. It wasn't taken. It's simply been set aside. Set aside? Molly's brows furrowed. Why? Because we're preserving tradition, Gladys said gently, as if speaking to a child. In this house we have a custom. New brides spend the first few weeks fully immersed in their new home without distractions. No phones, no internet. Just the land, the home, and the family. But my parents, my mother is expecting me to call. I didn't even get a chance to tell her I arrived safely. Gladys placed her teacup down delicately. She'll understand. In my day, one waited weeks to hear from a bride. Letters arrived by post, not text message. It did no harm to anyone. Molly opened her mouth, but something in the way the two other women watched her, silent, expectant, made her retreat. It's not the 1800s, she muttered under her breath, stepping back toward the door. She found herself pacing the hallway, trying to get a signal on the landline phone in the drawing room, but it was dead or disconnected. Her laptop showed no network available. Even her tablet, which had some offline messages downloaded, wouldn't load anything past the previous morning. She was completely cut off. Later that afternoon, a box arrived outside her bedroom door, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with twine. A card sat on top in scripted ink. For our new Hallworth bride, with love from your family. Inside were trinkets, a silk shawl with the family crest embroidered into it, a set of antique silver combs, and a journal with pressed flowers. It would have been charming if it didn't feel like a curated attempt to keep her occupied and compliant. But something about the handwriting on the envelope unsettled her. It looked off. Too uniform, too neat. Not Lawrence's handwriting. And certainly not her mother's. That evening, she asked the maid if any letters had come for her. The woman hesitated. Lady Gladys handles all incoming post, she replied flatly. Why? Because that's the rule. Whose rule? A pause. The house's. In the days that followed, the isolation deepened. At breakfast, Molly sat alone. Lawrence was always away at the stables, or down at the estate office, or handling family matters. No one ever gave her a straight answer about where he really was. Gregory appeared too often, too comfortably. He'd stroll past the breakfast room and wink or ask inappropriate questions in front of the staff. Gladys began guiding Molly through daily lessons. How to supervise the household accounts. How to properly address the groundskeepers. How to conduct herself during village events. Molly was expected to sit silently and learn. No questions, no commentary. The Hallworth women, Gladys said one morning, are not loud or opinionated. We carry the dignity of this estate on our shoulders. We preserve history with grace. Molly felt less like a bride and more like a museum exhibit. One afternoon, while exploring the old library, she came across a locked drawer in the writing desk. Curiosity overwhelmed her. She fetched a hairpin and jimmied the lock. Inside were stacks of sealed letters tied with faded ribbon, some of them addressed to her. Her mother's familiar handwriting stared back at her from several unopened envelopes. Her breath caught. One envelope had been opened, then resealed. She peeled it open carefully. The letter inside was simple, full of warmth. Molly, love, I hope your new family is treating you well. If you ever need to talk, just ring me. I miss you already. Molly's fingers trembled. She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, heart pounding. Someone had read her private messages. Someone had deliberately kept them from her. She turned to leave and froze. Gregory was standing at the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. Found something interesting? He asked. Molly quickly shut the drawer. Just some old paperwork. He stepped closer, his voice low. You know, this house has a rhythm. It's best not to go poking around in corners that don't concern you. Wouldn't want to get lost, would we? She stared at him. Where's Lawrence? Gregory smiled. Busy. You'll see him when he's ready. Molly's jaw clenched. This isn't a home. It's a trap. Gregory chuckled. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Hallworth. That night, Molly locked her bedroom door for the first time. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring out at the moorlands in the dark, the journal still unopened on her lap. Every instinct in her body screamed one truth louder than anything else. She was not a wife. She was a possession. And someone in this house had gone to great lengths to make sure she stayed that way. The third night in Hallworth Manor fell with an eerie silence, one that seemed to settle not just outside the ancient windows, but within the very bones of the house. The ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs had become a constant rhythm of unease for Molly. Every tick sounded like a countdown, though to what, she didn't yet know. Molly sat at the vanity, brushing her hair in the dim candlelight. The manor had electricity, but Gladys insisted on using lamps and wax tapers. It keeps us grounded in our heritage, she had said. Molly now suspected it was just another method of control, another way to keep her cut off from modernity, from help. A soft knock broke the silence. She didn't move. Who is it? She called cautiously. No answer. She crossed to the door, heart hammering, and pulled it open, just an inch. Too late. Gregory pushed past her into the room with the casual entitlement of someone walking into his own study. He wore no jacket, just a loose linen shirt with the collar undone. His hair was wet, as if he'd just returned from a bath, or perhaps a drink-fueled wander through the estate. Don't worry, little bride, he said, scanning the room. Just came to see if you'd settled in. Get out, Molly said, trying to keep her voice firm. This is my room. You have no right. Gregory turned to her, smile fading. My dear Molly, he said, stepping closer, I have every right. You're a Hallworth bride now. That means you belong to this family, not just Lawrence. I married Lawrence, not you, not anyone else in this house. He chuckled, tilting his head. You still think this marriage is just about love? About some quaint little romance? No, sweetheart. You married into blood and land, and here we preserve what matters most. She backed away. Lawrence is my husband. Gregory's face darkened. Lawrence, he spat, was the second son, a pet, always obedient, but second. I run this estate, I manage the land, I maintain the legacy, and that means I come first. He moved to touch her arm. Molly slapped his hand away and screamed, Don't you dare! At that moment, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Molly bolted to the door and threw it open, only to find Gladys standing there, arms folded, entirely unperturbed. Is everything all right in here? She asked, in that calm, silken tone that now made Molly's skin crawl. He came into my room, Molly said, trembling. He touched me. Gladys looked at Gregory, who simply shrugged. We were talking. Get him out, Molly hissed, but Gladys only sighed. Gregory, darling, give her some space. She's still adjusting. Gregory grinned and brushed past Molly on his way out, whispering, You'll understand soon enough. When he was gone, Molly slammed the door and turned to Gladys. You saw that, you heard what he said, and you just stood there. Gladys stepped into the room and sat in the wing-back chair, as though nothing had happened. Sit, Molly. No. I said sit. Something in her voice cracked like ice. Molly, shaking, sat at the edge of the bed. Gladys folded her hands. You need to understand the Hallworth way. We don't marry multiple times across generations. We marry once, one wife, one legacy, shared by the brothers of the house. Molly stared at her, barely breathing. That's not marriage, that's ownership. It's preservation, Gladys said coldly. Do you know how many families lost their land when greed and jealousy tore them apart? We don't let that happen here. This estate remains united, through discipline, through shared inheritance, including the bride. No, Molly whispered. You can't be serious. Gladys stood. You married the name, Molly, not the man, and now you must bear the weight of that name. That night, Molly didn't sleep. She locked the door, jammed a chair beneath the handle, and sat by the window until dawn. Her hands clutched the letter from her mother that she'd hidden in her dressing gown. It was her only connection to the world beyond these walls. Sometime near midnight, she heard voices drifting up through the floorboards. She crept toward the vent near the fireplace, an old metal grate connected to the servants' kitchen below. The voices were male, slurred with drink, laughing. Gregory had his chance, one voice muttered. Why does he always go first? Because he's the heir, stupid. Not anymore, that title means nothing if the land doesn't yield. Let the girl sleep a night or two, she's too jumpy. Another laughed. I'll calm her down. Molly covered her mouth. They were planning her like she was some shared meal, something to be passed around in the name of blood and land. Her stomach churned. This was abuse, ritualized, inherited, justified. By morning she knew she couldn't wait for rescue. She had to act. She opened her wardrobe and gathered the warmest clothes she had, tucking a small knife from the fruit tray into her coat pocket. She wrapped the letter from her mother in cloth and tied it to her thigh, but as she turned to open the door, she found it stuck, not locked, bolted from the outside. Later, when a maid finally came to bring her breakfast, Molly tried to pretend calm. What's your name? She asked. Clara. Clara? Do you ever think about leaving here? The maid didn't meet her eyes. This house takes care of its own. And if someone doesn't want to belong? Clara hesitated. Then quietly she said, then they disappear. Or stay quiet. Molly closed her eyes. She was surrounded by silence, rules no one questioned, a man she'd married who hadn't spoken to her in days, a brother-in-law who thought he owned her, a mother-in-law who enforced abuse as duty. She was alone, but not broken, not yet. Rain swept across the windows of Hallworth Manor in erratic gusts, blurring the view of the fields beyond into grey swirls of mist. Molly sat by the unlit fireplace in the library, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She had barely slept in days. The faces in the portraits above her seemed to watch in silence, their painted eyes cold and indifferent. She didn't know where Lawrence was. No one would say, no one ever said anything real in this house. The door creaked open behind her. I thought I'd find you here, came Gladys's voice. Soft, controlling, like a piano played one deliberate note at a time. Molly didn't turn around. Gladys moved into the room and poured herself a glass of port from the decanter. She studied her for a moment. You've been very quiet lately. You've locked me in my room, Molly said flatly. You've kept my letters, taken my phone, and allowed your son to... That's quite enough, Gladys interrupted, her tone sharpening like a knife across porcelain. Molly stood now, eyes blazing. You want me to accept this madness, to lie down and let your sons treat me like I'm part of the inheritance? Gladys set her glass down with a calmness that was more chilling than rage. She approached slowly and gestured to the old armchair across from Molly. Sit. I'd rather stand. I wasn't asking. A long, brittle silence followed. Then Molly sat. Gladys took a breath. I never meant for you to learn all this so quickly. In my time, it came gradually, over months, years. You would have had time to adjust, to understand. There's nothing to understand, Molly spat. You've institutionalized abuse. You've wrapped it in ribbons and tradition. Gladys's face darkened for a moment, but then the familiar cold mask returned. You think I'm cruel, but you haven't lived long enough to know what survival requires. She walked to the hearth and lit a match, holding it to the logs until the fire caught. Its low crackle filled the room. When I came here, Gladys began, I was younger than you, 17. I married Edward Hallworth, Lawrence's grandfather. But on my wedding night, it wasn't Edward who came to my room, it was his brother. Molly froze. I was terrified. I cried. But my mother-in-law told me something that stayed with me. She turned to Molly. This house only survives if the land stays whole. The land stays whole if the name does, and the name stays if the woman does. That's not wisdom, Molly said softly. That's control. Gladys laughed bitterly. Call it what you want, but we're still here. This estate has never fractured. No divorces, no division of land, no legal mess, because we marry once per generation, one bride, bound to all. Molly shook her head. What about love? Love? Gladys gave a cruel smile. It comes. Eventually, if you play your part. Lawrence? Does he even care about me? Lawrence cares about duty. That is what we raised him to do. Feelings complicate the legacy. Molly felt sick. So I'm an asset? Gladys didn't deny it. She crossed to the bookshelves and pulled down an old, leather-bound volume. Inside was a family ledger. She opened it to a yellowed page and placed it before Molly. Names, dates, handwritten entries of every bride. Each entry listed not just the husband, but his brothers. Every generation, one woman, multiple men, bound under the Hallworth seal. I stayed, Gladys said, sitting again, and I made this house thrive. My brothers-in-law adored me in the end. They died calling my name. How romantic, Molly muttered, eyes still on the ledger. And what happened to the women who refused? Gladys didn't answer immediately. Then, there's a small graveyard behind the orchard, 3 stones without names. Molly stared at her. You're insane. No, Gladys said, I'm loyal. The fire flared, casting deep shadows across the rug. Molly stood slowly. This ends with me, she said. I will not be a signature in that book. You already are, Gladys replied calmly. You signed the marriage certificate. You stepped into this house. You wore our name. You belong to us now, in spirit and in law. Law? Molly laughed, broken and bitter. If the law found out what you've done. No one believes a bride who vanishes, Gladys whispered, and no one finds her again. That night, Molly returned to her room and bolted the door, heart pounding like a trapped animal's. She lit a candle and stared at the journal they'd given her, the one with the pressed flowers and silk ribbon. She opened to the first blank page and wrote one line. If anyone finds this, I was never mad. I was married to the Hallworths. Then she closed it, wrapped herself in a shawl and stared at the flickering shadows on the wall, knowing she would never sleep again in this house with peace. Only with purpose. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the grounds of Hallworth Manor glazed in dew and mist. Molly awoke before the sun, fully clothed and lying atop the covers. Her candle had burned itself out, the wax hardened in ripples across the nightstand. She rose silently and walked to the window, watching the fog drift low over the hedgerows like a ghost clinging to the land. This was the morning, her chance. She had studied the staff routines over the last few days. Breakfast was served at 8. The cook's boy arrived at the back gate at 7:30, delivering bread from the village. The groundskeeper lit the stable's lanterns around the same time, and for a brief 10-minute window, the outer courtyard remained unguarded. She had no phone, no map, no money. Only a coat, a small knife she'd hidden in her sleeve, and a slip of paper, her mother's letter, folded tight and bound against her ankle with ribbon. At 7:20 she crept down the east corridor barefoot, carrying her boots in one hand. The manor was silent except for the groan of old floorboards beneath her. She passed the parlour, the formal drawing room, and the corridor that led to the servants' entrance. Then she saw it, the back door, unlocked just as she'd hoped. Her hand trembled as she turned the handle. The outside air hit her like a wave of freedom, wet, earthy, cold. She ran, boots now on her feet, coat flapping behind her like wings. Through the hedgerow, across the eastern path, down the side of the paddock. The village, she knew, was just over the ridge, past the stone wall that bordered the estate. Every step felt heavier with dread. She half expected a hand to grab her from behind, but none came. She made it to the lane and saw the red telephone box through the trees. A relic from another era, much like the manor, but right now, her salvation. Inside, the phone was mercifully functional. Her fingers, numb with cold and panic, trembled as she dialed. Her father picked up on the second ring. "Dad, it's me, it's Molly." "Molly, where are you? What's wrong?" She was crying now, voice shaking. "I need help. I've made a mistake. This place, it's not right. They've taken everything. They're watching me. I think they'll try to make me disappear." There was silence on the other end. Then, "Stay where you are. I'm calling the police." But before she could say more, she heard it. The gravel crunch of boots. A shadow moved past the glass. She turned and saw Gregory, smiling. She didn't remember the struggle clearly, only the panic, the kicking, the hands pulling her from the phone box and dragging her into the estate Land Rover. He drove in silence while she screamed, thrashed, begged. Her voice broke. Her nails clawed at the door, but the locks had been secured from his side. When they reached the manor, two of the other brothers were already waiting at the side entrance, George and Peter, their expressions unreadable. Molly was pulled from the vehicle and carried, arms flailing, into the cellar. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind her. Darkness, cold stone, silence. Hours passed. Time became meaningless. She lay on the hard floor, shivering. The cellar smelled of earth, damp wood and old wine. Cobwebs danced in the corners. Rats scurried nearby. Then the door creaked open. A lantern light pooled on the steps. Gladys appeared. She descended slowly, setting the lantern on a barrel and sitting on an upturned crate. "I'm disappointed," she said softly. Molly said nothing. "I gave you more freedom than any Hallworth bride before you, and this is how you repay it." "You kidnapped me," Molly said hoarsely. "You're keeping me here like a prisoner." Gladys leaned forward. "You tried to tear this family apart. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I tried to survive," Molly whispered. Gladys studied her for a long moment, then stood. "You'll stay here until you remember your place. This house doesn't take betrayal lightly." Before she left, Molly forced herself to speak. "Check the bread basket," she said quietly. Gladys paused. "What?" "I left something in it." She had written the note quickly that morning before leaving the manor. A desperate plea scrawled in pencil on a torn page from the Hallworth family ledger. She had tucked it into the basket, carried daily by the cook's boy, praying someone in the village would see it before the family did. "My name is Molly Hallworth. I am being held against my will at Hallworth Manor. Please help me." It was all she had left. A message, a name, a truth. Deep in the cold dark of the cellar, she closed her eyes and imagined the morning light in her childhood home. Her mother humming, her father reading the paper, the scent of cinnamon and toast. She held that image like a shield against the silence, because if no one came for her soon, she wasn't sure she'd make it out at all. The bread boy was late that morning. His name was Jamie Fielding, 15, freckled, and always punctual, except today the fog had been too thick for his bike, and his boots were soaked through with marsh water by the time he reached Hallworth Manor. He set the fresh bread basket down beside the kitchen door and bent to collect the empty one from the day before. That's when he saw it, a folded piece of paper, creased, smudged, tucked beneath a linen napkin. His name wasn't on it. No address, just 2 sentences handwritten in a shaky scrawl. My name is Molly Hallworth. I am being held against my will at Hallworth Manor. Please help me. For a moment, Jamie just stood there, staring at the note. He knew the stories, of course. Everyone in Greywick did. The Hallworths were old money, old land, and older habits. But this was something else. He shoved the note into his coat pocket and took off back down the gravel lane, his delivery route abandoned, heart pounding in his ears. By the time the note reached Councillor Blackmore, the village had already begun whispering. Blackmore was a retired solicitor turned community elder, sharp-witted and not easily spooked. He read the note in silence, then called his niece, who worked at the North Yorkshire Constabulary. 2 hours later, Detective Chief Inspector Harriet Grayson was knocking on Blackmore's front door. She read the note, then read it again. Then she turned to Jamie. "You're sure this came from the manor?" Jamie nodded. "I swear on my mum." DCI Grayson didn't hesitate. Within the hour, she and a small task force were in an unmarked police vehicle headed for Hallworth Manor with a signed warrant and a quiet, simmering urgency. The gates of Hallworth Manor creaked open as the police arrived. Gladys Hallworth stood waiting in the entryway, lips painted the colour of dried roses, her posture perfect. She smiled politely as the officers entered. "May I ask the purpose of this visit?" she said, eyes fixed on DCI Grayson. "We've received credible information that someone in this house is being held against their will," Grayson replied, holding up the search warrant. "We'll need access to all rooms, including the cellar and servants' quarters." Gladys's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm afraid you've been misinformed," she said. "This is a respectable house." "Then you'll have nothing to hide," Grayson answered. The search began. It didn't take long. In the cellar, behind an old wine rack, the officers found a bolted door. Inside, sitting on the cold stone floor, was Molly. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken. She didn't move when the light flooded in, only shielded her eyes with a trembling hand. "Molly Hallworth?" an officer asked gently. She nodded, lips cracked and dry. "You're safe now," he said. "We're taking you out of here." When DCI Grayson entered, Molly spoke in a whisper. "They wouldn't let me leave. They said I was property, part of the land." Grayson knelt beside her. "We've got you. You're not going back." Molly was taken straight to hospital. The doctors confirmed signs of malnourishment, stress-induced trauma, and bruising on both arms. But she was alive. She was coherent. And most importantly, she wanted to talk. Over 2 hours, she gave her full statement, everything from the moment she arrived at the manor to the failed escape, the forced isolation, Gregory's advances, and the family's twisted doctrine. She didn't cry. She didn't even raise her voice. She spoke like someone reporting a crime she had only just realized was real. "We marry once per generation," she said. "One bride, shared." DCI Grayson asked her if she had any documents, anything that could support her story. "I left something in the family ledger," Molly said. "A page. I wrote it the night they locked me in the cellar." Grayson made a note. Back at the manor, the police returned with a forensic team. The Hallworth brothers, Gregory, George, Peter, and Lawrence were separated and questioned. Lawrence, when confronted, broke quickly. "I didn't touch her," he said. "It was Gregory. He arranged everything. Mum made it sound normal, like it was our duty." Gregory refused to speak at all. Peter shook his head. "We didn't hurt her. It's how it's always been." And in the attic, behind a false panel in the back of a chest, they found more letters, diaries, legal documents decades old. One in particular stood out, a formal complaint made by a woman in 1983. A Hallworth bride. Her name was Eleanor Marston. The complaint was never filed. Instead, it bore the stamp of a private solicitor and the chilling words, "Resolved privately, family matter." They also found 3 birth certificates with no mothers listed and a ledger. Inside, pressed between the pages, was a torn sheet with fresh pencil marks. "If anyone finds this, I was never mad. I was married to the Hallworths." It was signed Molly. That night, the village of Greywick didn't sleep. The manor gates were sealed by police. News vans circled the village green by dawn. Reporters knocked on every door. Headlines blared across national papers. "Yorkshire manor bride held captive. Inherited abuse at Hallworth Estate. Arrests made in decades-long family pact." But in the centre of it all, Molly Whittaker sat quietly in her hospital bed, hands folded in her lap. When asked by the nurse if she needed anything, she replied simply, "Just some silence." Because for the first time in weeks, the silence belonged to her. The trial of the Crown as the Hallworth family began 3 months later in a crowded courtroom in North Yorkshire. The hall was packed with journalists, activists, and curious locals who had once spoken the Hallworth name with reverence. Now they whispered it with disgust and disbelief. The 4 Hallworth brothers sat in a single row, Gregory stone-faced, George visibly anxious, Peter twitching his foot beneath the bench, and Lawrence staring blankly ahead, gaunt and silent. Gladys Hallworth, dressed in her signature navy coat and pearls, sat between 2 solicitors with an air of quiet defiance, as if the whole affair were merely a misunderstanding. At the prosecution's table sat DCI Harriet Grayson, arms folded, her notes neatly arranged. She had built the case meticulously, timeline, evidence, testimonies and history woven together like strands in a noose, and beside her sat Molly. Though still visibly shaken, she was no longer a shadow. Her posture was upright, her eyes clear. The media had turned her into a symbol. Some called her the manor bride, others the Yorkshire hostage. But here, in this courtroom, she was not a headline. She was a survivor, a witness. The Crown's barrister, a sharp-eyed woman named Julia Penrose, opened with clarity and calm force. This case is not about tradition. It is not about land. It is about control, silence, and abuse disguised as heritage. The defendants orchestrated and perpetuated a system of coercion against the victim, Mrs. Molly Whittaker, now legally separated from Mr. Lawrence Hallworth, under the pretense of family practice. We will show that this so-called tradition is nothing more than systemic exploitation. She turned toward the jury. And in this courtroom, we end it. Over several days, the prosecution presented damning evidence. Molly's handwritten plea from the breadbasket, the police's discovery of letters in the attic, financial records revealing hush payments made to a former maid, and, most chilling of all, the family ledger, decades of names, all following the same pattern, one bride, multiple husbands. A former Hallworth gardener, now retired and living in Whitby, testified that he had once overheard Gladys say, "The girl won't last unless we break her in early." Even the village's priest admitted under cross-examination that he had heard whispers for years but said nothing out of respect. But it was Molly's own testimony that brought the room to stillness. She walked to the witness stand alone, dressed simply, no makeup, her voice low and steady. They told me I was lucky, that I'd married into legacy, into security. But I wasn't treated like a wife. I was treated like an object, like a gift passed around a room. Every time I said no, I was told I didn't understand that it was my duty. She paused. The courtroom was silent, all breath held. Tradition should not require the destruction of a person, and love, real love, doesn't hide behind locked doors. The defense tried to discredit her, of course. Gladys's solicitor described Molly as unstable, easily confused, overly romantic. They produced old social media posts, twisted words out of context, and implied she fabricated everything to escape an emotionally demanding marriage. Gregory's lawyer argued that no physical harm was ever proven, that Molly was free to leave at any time and simply misinterpreted family dynamics. But the evidence told a different story. And Lawrence, to the shock of his brothers, took the stand. "I knew it was wrong," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "but I didn't know how to stop it. I was raised to believe our family came first, that the land, the legacy, mattered more than anyone's feelings. I didn't love her properly, I didn't protect her, and for that, I'm guilty." When it came time for the verdict, the jury deliberated only 6 hours. Gregory Hallworth, guilty of unlawful imprisonment and sexual coercion. George and Peter Hallworth, guilty of complicity and aiding abuse. Lawrence Hallworth, guilty of emotional abuse and obstruction. Gladys Hallworth, guilty of orchestrating and sustaining a coercive family structure. The judge's remarks echoed through the chamber. "You cloaked your crimes in the language of legacy. You manipulated silence and loyalty into weapons. You believed land and blood gave you power over others. You were wrong." Sentences were passed. Gregory received 13 years. The others ranged from 6 to 10. Gladys, despite her age, was sentenced to 7 years in a correctional facility with no early release. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. Molly was offered microphones, cameras, interviews. She refused them all. Instead, she walked alone down the stone steps, her coat buttoned to the collar, her hair tied back, her hands steady. A new name, no longer Hallworth, rested quietly on her court documents. She disappeared from the public eye within a week. Some said she moved to Edinburgh, others believed she wrote under a pseudonym. A few claimed she returned to Hallworth Manor one last time, just to watch it be auctioned and divided. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. She ended the tradition, and in doing so set fire to a system that had burned countless women before her. 3 months later, a book appeared under a pseudonym, The Bride and the Land. It wasn't listed as memoir, but it didn't need to be. The story was of a woman who walked into a house thinking it was her future, only to find it was her cage. The book became a bestseller within weeks. Book clubs debated its meaning. Feminist circles praised its rawness. Legal scholars cited it in lectures about coercive control. But Molly never claimed it, never attended readings, never signed copies. She didn't want recognition, she wanted peace. Then came the letter. It arrived at DCI Harriet Grayson's desk in a plain envelope. There was no return address, just a single-page note, typed. To those who listened, thank you. To those who believed, thank you. And to the ones who didn't, may your daughters never need saving. Attached was a pressed flower, a white rose. Years passed. The Hallworth brothers faded from headlines. Gladys died quietly in custody, her obituary a dry column beside supermarket adverts. Greywick changed too. The new landowners converted the estate grounds into a women's retreat centre, ironically named the Hallworth Foundation for Recovery and Autonomy. No portraits, no ledgers, just open fields, warm food and safe doors that locked from the inside. They say a woman visited once. walked through the new rose garden, stood where the old gatehouse used to be, left a note and disappeared before anyone saw her leave. The note read, "I buried my silence here, let something else grow in its place." And Molly, her real name was never forgotten. She became something more than the victim of a crime. She became the reason many others finally spoke up, the quiet voice that grew louder in others, the bride who was never meant to survive, and did. Final reflection. Some houses are made of stone, some of secrets. Hallworth Manor was both, but the most dangerous structure was never the manor itself. It was the tradition that held its walls up. And when one woman stepped forward and dared to shake those foundations, she didn't just bring down a house, she buried a legacy.